Poor Panofsky pouring over his tomes. So questions about Thomas Kuhn, about this idea of science or history, maybe how it fits in with the other readings, although since I'm not teaching LNT, I might not be fully in tune with that. Yeah?
What are some of the current movements that reflect on Kuhn's ideas during his time?
That's a great question. I would say, first and foremost, the field of philosophy of science. Occasionally there are people where you would say, that guy almost invented a subfield of philosophy of science. In Kuhn's case, you could almost say in the US, he redefined the entire field of philosophy of science. Really, after Kuhn, almost everybody might argue with him, but everybody agrees that the sort of image of science that he started off with, criticizing, the notion that science just uncovers things once and for all. Very few, if anybody, in history of science, and actually not that many scientists would say fits in that way, right? And so I'd say history of science in its own. With that, I would also say fields like science studies, which looks at sort of the critical reflexiveness. I would say the sort of hip theorist at the moment who goes beyond Kuhn, but I think is interesting, is Bruno Latour. We have the Parliament of Reality out there. If you ever go hear Olaf Eliasson's initial speech he gives at the Parliament of Reality when he dedicates it, he basically says, well, young people around the world are being moved by these new ideas of, and he starts talking about Bruno Latour. And he's talking about that because he's saying that's a way of thinking of nature and culture, not as settled phenomena, but as all in process and change. And then finally, I guess I would say systems theory, but that's sort of obscure, but that's sort of a particularly continental sort of interest in looking at things as complex systems rather than as just finished products. But in a way, I mean, what makes the book so huge, I said it's of interest just if you're in the business for the next few years of reading books. It's interesting just because it's rare to find a book that's so powerful in the field that I would say in history and philosophy of science, it's almost the starting point of most arguments, even though a lot of people would, I think, argue with it. Other questions? Yeah?
You said that Kuhn believes that for the most part, that mostly people take theory to be fact, which isn't actually fact. Does he believe that there is fact at all?
That's a great question, because this becomes the big Kuhn controversy. Remember, he writes the book in 1961. As I mentioned, it's sort of a product of Cold War funding to some extent. You can imagine the 60s are just happening, right? And as the 60s start happening, Kuhn's ideas get picked up as saying essentially there is no absolute fact, right? That really science is just theories that are conventional and are working, and that just happens to be so, and other theories that do the same job just as well. Kuhn himself occasionally sort of goes along that line, but I would say overall his, in the end assessment, he would say there are absolutely facts. But the key thing, and the reason I started with that Gestalt image, is he would say the facts always are explained within a particular theory. And the reason I use the example of motion is to say, you can imagine the same motion, me throwing a pencil and it falling to the ground, is still the same thing. There's no doubt the motion is there. But for the Aristotelians, it's explained one way, for the Newtonians, it's explained another way, right? And for sort of Einstein and Minkowski, it's explained yet a third way. And Kuhn isn't doubting that the fact is there. He's not doubting that Aristotelian physics did a halfway decent job explaining, say, cannon fire, and that Newtonian physics did a much better job, but couldn't explain electromagnetism at all, right? But he's saying the facts get resituated. And I think that's the key distinction. And it's also the key confusion that caught people. Because a lot of people sort of looked at Kuhn as purely a relativist. And he sort of spent, actually, in some ways, the rest of his life arguing against that. So it's sort of exactly the right question. Other questions? Anything else? Anything specifically confusing, perplexing? It was all utterly lucid. I somehow got it. Yeah?
How does he explain which new theory is accepted once the old ones are not accepted?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because again, if you really take his theory seriously, he's saying there's not an absolute way of weighing paradigms. And he's saying in particular you can't weigh them against reality. So in fact, he says you weigh the paradigms against each other. Essentially what solutions and what problems is one opening up and is the other closing. And in general, that's a sort of reduction of error on one hand and an opening up of important new problems. So the difference between paradigms, say between Newton and Einstein, ends up being on one hand, it gets rid of an old problem, right? It gets rid of the fiction of ether, right? There was a fiction that all of space was filled with this neutral stuff, each letter requiring to have emotion in reference to something. He gets rid of that, that's a big convenience. If it just did that, it might not be a winning paradigm, and indeed Einstein is doubted by a lot of people. But then it starts opening up whole new questions, and those start gaining traction. And he says that moment is when paradigms start to win. But the important point he wants to make is to say that's not because the paradigm is doing better vis-a-vis reality. Because his whole theory is based on the idea we don't have access to an absolute reality. It's doing better at getting stuff done for communities. And in that way, he is in part sort of a pragmatist to some extent. But it's a tricky question, and it's one of the key things that people argue with him with, or argue against with him. But I would say over time, a lot of scientists have sort of agreed with it. The more each of these major fields, and again, remember, even if Kuhn was writing in the 1880s, in the 1880s, Max Planck, who went on to become a famous physicist, his teacher, a graduate teacher, told him not to go into physics. Because he said there's essentially no problems left in physics, right? We really only have a light problem and a heat problem and a little electromagnetism. We'll be done with these in 5 years. That's how complete they thought the Newtonian paradigm was. Then to imagine that only 20 years later, everybody would say the entire field is on an entirely new footing. That means that for a lot of scientists, something like Kuhn's idea made more sense. And then when they watch that then split into the argument of quantum physics, and they see they can say, okay, this is a healthy way of looking at our whole field. And it's also more social, right? You can now say, instead of claiming that you're totally wrong, you can just say, well, you're just in a different paradigm. You can still claim the person's paradigm is wrong, but it's somehow a little bit nicer than returning to a sort of religious dogma argument of you have reality wrong. And that becomes the basis of that. Yeah.
We were talking this morning about the relationship of sense of beauty to a sense of scientific discovery and creativity. I just thought that should be the church window, the idea that the same light could be closer to divinity or further depending on sort of what came to it. Did Kuhn have anything to say about beauty?
Kuhn, not so much, although as I mentioned, really between 1950 and 1990, the book becomes quite famous in the arts and in humanities. And I would say not so much for beauty as for creativity itself, and if we understand beauty as a form of creativity, then I would say yes. He would say basically it moves the concept of creativity from something that's simply the sort of power of the individual to something that's much more based on institutions, communities, norms, and changing history as a whole, in a way, right? And it really changes beauty into something that is a mode of transforming reality, rather than just a sort of individual achievement. And I think that's the same thing he's trying to do with scientific creativity, is to say that it's not simply that, like a psychologist, you want to find a creative person. You want to figure out what makes the situation, and then having creative people will be great within that.